Okay, James, bring me some more wood. So,
We do this.
all right. So, James,
This wood.
can you tell me what happened 400 years ago right now?
The Pilgrims landed on Plymouth.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And it was a day like this one, only a lot colder. We're further south than Plymouth, and I just checked the weather in Plymouth this morning, and it was really cold. And for the next few days, it's going to be really cold. And so, a fire being made with wet wood in a wet forest with wet leaves all around, because it just did rain here recently, and so feel how wet that stick is.
Yeah.
It's hard to get a fire going when all you have is wet wood, right? Yeah. But you can, and if it's really hot, can you feel the warmth?
Yeah.
Now, what do you imagine it felt like for pilgrims who'd been on a ship for months and whose clothes were all wet? They had never been able to bathe. They'd never been able to make a fire on the ship. They'd never been able to get dried out. So this would have been, don't you think, one of the very first things they did when they got ashore?
They heated up water.
Well, the women did when they came on shore, but the women didn't get to come on shore for a very long time until the men had checked everything out to make sure things were safe. Now, the first places they landed, up near where Provincetown is now, they did have some skirmishes with the Indians who were there. And they thought it was so dangerous they better lift anchor, sail to a different place, and that was Plymouth. And actually, James, they didn't get there until December. So where they first landed in November, just like where it is right now, middle of November, where we are today, it was a little bit warmer, but it was still very, very cold because that area of Massachusetts is really cold. So how did they survive? What do you think? What other things did they do to survive?
They built themselves houses.
Yes.
And they made fires.
And what did they build their houses out of?
Wood.
Right. Where'd they get the wood?
From trees.
Right. Okay. So, how many houses do you think they were able to build? Seven. Now, why could they only have built 7 houses when there were so many of them? How many pilgrims were there? When they landed on the shore,
700.
it was 102. Okay, so what? Why did they only get 7 houses built?
Because the men were so weak that from that long voyage that they weren't able to build houses.
That's correct. On the second month of their voyage, they hit really rough seas, James, and the Mayflower couldn't really take the waves, and it began leaking pretty badly. And what that meant was,
They might sink.
well, yeah, they might have sunk, but first what it meant was they were wet all the time. They were wet lying in their little bunks. They were wet everywhere. They were wet if they went up on top of the deck to get some fresh air. Why would they want to get fresh air?
I don't know.
You just think about how it might smell down below deck. How do you think?
It would smell really bad.
It would. This coat you have on is a wool coat. If it gets wet and stays wet for a long time, it's not going to smell very good. And their clothing was wool in the same way. And on top of that, James, I hate to tell you this, but they were seasick a lot of the time, which meant what?
I don't know.
They would throw up.
Yeah.
And so if they would throw up on the floor, it would be slick, and they'd slip, and they'd fall down on the ship and get it on their clothes. And it must have smelled horrible on that ship. And they would like to go on top of the deck where they could get the breezes, but it was sea spray, making them wet all over again. So it was wet up on top, it was wet down below. What was the name of the deck that they had to live on? It's called the The gun deck.
Yeah,
Right. Why do they call it a gun deck?
because there was cannons on it.
What kind of guns?
Cannons
Right. Okay. Why would a boat like that need cannon?
to protect it.
From?
Pirates.
Right. Did they see any pirates on the way over?
No, I don't think so.
No, they didn't. They didn't. But the ship was built, as many ships were, to have some cannon, even a few. And the Mayflower always had 6, or it was capable of having 6. They had 6 gun ports that could open up, and the gun deck had a place for powder and shot, and they brought powder and shot, and they brought cannon for the Pilgrims. Why would the Pilgrims need cannon in the New World?
Because they didn't know what they would need.
Well, that's true. They actually did know from reports of other travelers who'd been there that there could be some really hostile people there in the New World. In fact, one of the previous ships that had come over bringing Squanto, all of the ship's crew were killed.
How?
Well, the Indians killed them. So
Not Squanto.
They killed everybody but Squanto, and they took him back because he had been a slave. He'd been taken as a slave to go back over to Europe, right? Okay. Let's think about those first few days that the Pilgrims were there. Okay, are you ready?
Yeah.
They arrived on the 11th of November. Some of them were afraid to go ashore because they didn't have the legal authority to go ashore right there in Massachusetts. So they sat down together and they wrote up a document. Do you remember what it was called?
No.
The Mayflower.
Document.
Say again.
Document.
Well, it was called the Mayflower Compact, which is like the Mayflower contract. But it was a contract between all of the people who were there, that they would form themselves together in an orderly government, and they would have a sovereign over them, who was King James back in England, and they would make their own laws, which would be just laws, and they would agree to abide by all of those laws together. Okay? That's why they did that. So even when you get a fire built and you get it going and you can feel the heat,
Yeah.
the smoke's a problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
They had to live with that. When they finally were able to build their homes, they did have fire pits and chimneys so that the women wouldn't have to have smoke in their faces all the time, and that really did help. But fires like these, which they did make to warm themselves, the smoke is annoying. But this is what one of the hardships was that they had to face. And there were so many. Can you think of another hardship they had to face?
They had to do the voyage, which was the hard.
They had to do what?
They had to do the voyage.
Yeah, the voyage, I think, probably was the hardest thing of all. And they were on that ship for such a long time. And here's why. Let me tell you the story. It was kind of like a business. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Okay, so the Pilgrims didn't have any money. They were broke. How are they going to get money to go overseas to the New World? Well, they went to some investors and said, look, if you give us some money to go overseas together, we will try to earn money over there and pay you back the money that you loan us. And the investors said, well, how will you do it? And they said, well, maybe we can grow tobacco. Maybe we can harvest furs, because furs were very valuable. Maybe we can trade with the Indians and get furs from them. And so the investors said, well, okay, I think it's worth a risk. So they loaned the money to the Pilgrims, but while all these negotiations were going on, the Pilgrims were stuck in the ports over there in England, waiting on the ship. So they were actually already living on the ship. And it was expensive. They had to pay rent to be in that port with their ship. They had to start selling off some of their provisions and their food that they had on ship just to pay the rent. Well, finally they got enough money to make the voyage, to pay the captain, to pay the crew, and they took off. But even after they took off, they'd been living on the ship for such a long time because they were homeless people with no money. And then they were on board that ship on a horribly rough voyage. Now, the first few days were not rough, but the last few days were extremely rough, so that when they finally got to the New World, they were cold and wet, and it was winter time, and they were miserable. And the only people who could go on shore were men who had weapons and had their muskets and were able to get there and explore the land and try to figure out where to go. Well, they finally found the place they wanted to settle, and it was on the top of a big hill because why did they put it there?
Because they wanted to build a fort.
They wanted to build a fort. They knew they had to build a fort. So it was a really good place for a fort, but they weren't even able to get to that place until December. And it was cold and rainy, and like you said, the men were too weak to really be building the houses. Now they did build some storage buildings for some of the goods and the food that they had on board ship. There was not much left, but they did have some, and they were able to put it into those buildings, but not until the very end of January. So they were living, and it was miserable, and many of them were dying, and they were having to stop and have secret funerals. Why were the funerals secret?
I don't know.
So that they didn't want certain people to find those graves, right? And so they buried him in secret, usually at night, and it was difficult, and they were weak and too weak to dig graves. So, James, it was a hard life, and we need to be remembering this because they knew they were doing it for a reason. What do you think they knew the reason was? Well, the reason was they were trying to build a new country. And they believed that when they got married and had children, that their children would get married and have children. How many descendants do you think there are of those surviving pilgrims, those 45 pilgrims who lived? Do you know the number?
No.
It's 30 million descendants who are alive today. Is your fire going out?
Yeah, I'm starting it again.
Okay, so even to have a fire and to have warmth, you have to continue to work it. Find wood, process the wood, put wood on the fire. And we've not been able to stop feeding the fire for very long before it just starts dying. This is the kind of life that they had to live, James, and they were willing to do it and willing to make the trip and take the risk because they had us in mind and what kind of country that we might be able to have. So I'm thankful for them.